Hopefully you can hear me. Today's daf in Masechet Zevachim, in the second parak on Chol HaMoed, is Chaf Chet, 28. Good morning, Nava. Right and early. Okay, so I'm going to read the Mishnah very quickly on the bottom of Chav Zayin Amud Bet. We did it last night. It'll take 1 minute, and then we'll get into today's exciting Gemara. Says the Mishnah on Chav Zayin Amud Bet, Hashochet hazevach. This person does shchita of a karban, lizrok damol b'chutz, with the thought that they're going to sprinkle the blood outside the Beit HaMikdash, or some of the blood, or mixat damol b'chutz, or lahakdir emurav b'chutz. They're going to put the limbs on a mizbeach to burn them outside the Beit HaMikdash, mixat emurav b'chutz, or some of them. Or the third thing is le'echol b'saro b'chutz. They're going to eat the meat of a karban outside where they're supposed to eat it, usually outside the Beit HaMikdash or outside of Jerusalem. Kazayim b'saro b'chutz. Le'echol kazayim mi'or ha'aliyah b'chutz. So they're even going to eat a piece of the skin over the tail, which generally you don't eat skin of an animal, but that's very soft near the tail, and I guess you could roast it and it could be edible. We'll see in the Gemara. That all those cases because it's outside of the right place. It's chutz lemikomo, it's pasol be'ein bo karet. But 3 lines in the bottom, if your thought is to do it outside the right time, so lizrok damo lemachar, to sprinkle the blood the next day, or where my mixat damo lemachar, or the haktir emurav lemachar, or mixat emurav lemachar, in all of the cases, if you want to do it, if you think to do it in the wrong time, that's pigol v'chayavin alav karet. Then you get karet. Says the Gemara today.
So which korbanot are these? Isn't it the korban Pesach? Isn't it forbidden to eat the tail?
Yeah, we're going to see. Well, yes, for most korbanot, we're going to actually discuss this today. The tail is brought on the mizbeach, right? Some animals don't really have a tail, but usually the tail fat, which is part of the chelav of the animal, is put on the mizbeach. We're not talking here about the tail. We're talking about the covering, meaning the skin, not the fat of the tail, which is the aliyah, which we often talk about, but the skin on top of the aliyah. So yes, but we're going to discuss that
But
today.
I think the korban Pesach, you're not permitted to eat the tail.
Again, just so clarify, this is not the tail; it's the skin on top of the tail. So not the fat, which is a big problem, or a problem, not a big problem, but the skin, the skin on top of it. There's no real prohibition on eating that. The question is it part on the mizbeach, first of all? And second of all, is it even edible, right? Do you consider skin to be something that's normal to eat? Or do you say, the hide of an animal is not normally what people eat, right?
Well, there's a whole Gemara in the beginning of Pesachim about the tail. And there's a story about send someone to get the tail, and they find out he's a non-Jew. He said that's how they find out he's a non-Jew, because he said he wanted to eat tail was the delicious part, and so forth. And they said that then he put him to death, something like this. And the Gemara,
you're 100% correct. There's that story but again, that's referring to the aliyah, the tail. This is referring to the skin, the hide, the leather on top of the tail, not the tail itself. The leather on top of it, the skin on top of it. So it says the Gemara today, Savruo, we think at the bottom of Daf Chav Zayin Amud Bet, or ha'aliyah, that the skin on top of the tail is ka'aliyah dami, is like the tail. And as you just pointed out, the tail itself is put on the mizbeach, and you never eat it. And that was the great story in Pesachim, where they sent the Roman who was trying to pretend to be Jewish and said, ask for the best piece, right? Ask for the tail. And that's how they knew he was not Jewish or not correct. But says the Gemara, if the skin on top of the tail is the same status of the tail, then basically the aliyah is something that's supposed to be put on the mizbeach. So if you have a thought, I'm going to eat that tomorrow, that shouldn't matter because you're not supposed to eat it ever, right? Forget about eating it tomorrow. It's supposed to go on the mizbeach. So it says the Gemara at the top of Daf Chav Chet Amud Aleph, you're having a machshava about something that's supposed to be eaten by the mizbeach, like the tail, and saying, I'm going to eat it. And that is not usually, remember, pigos usually, well, again, we're going to discuss this, but pigos usually, if you do a thought, I'm supposed to eat it today, but I think I'm going to eat it tomorrow, or eat it in the wrong place. But this is not something you're supposed to eat at all. Says Shmuel, the second line, Amar Shmuel, Hamani Rebbe Eliezer. The Tana of our Mishnah is the Tana Rebbe Eliezer, who says, in fact, that you can have pigul in that case. The Amar mechashvin miachilat mizbeach lachilat adam, or miachilat adam lachilat mizbeach. That if you have a machshava, that let's say the meat that you're supposed to eat for people, you're going to put it on the mizbeach 3 days from now. So it's chutz lizmanu for something that's achilat adam, and you think about the mizbeach, or vice versa, something that's supposed to be on the mizbeach, and you say, I'm going to eat it in 3 days, that's considered pigul. So that town of our Mishnah has to be Rebbe Eliezer. Ditznan, what's this Mishnah we're referring to? It's a Mishnah later on Lamed Hey. Says the Mishnah, Hashochetet hazevach, if you shech the carbon with the thought, lechol davar she'in darko lechol, that you're going to eat something in a wrong time that you're not supposed to eat, right? Either because it goes on the mizbeach or it's not edible, or lahaktir davar she'in davar lahaktir, or you're going to put something in the mizbeach that you're not supposed to, kasher, that is kosher because the thought doesn't ruin it, because the thought was about the wrong thing, right? If you shech your carbon thinking, I'm going to eat the limbs that go on the Mizbeach in 3 days, that doesn't posel it because you don't eat them ever. But Rebbe Eliezer posel. But Rebbe Eliezer disagrees. And so this Tan of our Mishnah is Rebbe Eliezer, that even if you have a thought about eating the wrong thing, it would posel it. And so if you have a thought about eating the alya, the tail, even though you're not supposed to eat the tail, but you think I'm going to do it at the wrong time, that would posel it. Says the Gemara, 1 second. So how are you now explaining the Mishnah according to Shmuel? Okay, Rebbe Eliezer. You're saying our Mishnah is going only according to Rebbe Eliezer, not the Tanakama. Well, in Maseifa. So then read the end of the Mishnah. Now, the end of a Mishnah didn't happen yet. The end of our Mishnah will happen tomorrow, tomorrow on the end of Daf Chaf Tet. Is that tomorrow? Yeah. We will read a continuation of the Mishnah. But the Mishnah continues tomorrow and says, Zehaklal, and we say these are together because they're clearly related. This is the rule of Pigel. Kol hashochet v'hamikabel v'hamolich v'hazorik. Anyone who does any of the four major acts, slaughtering an animal, accepting the blood, walking with the blood, or sprinkling the blood, le'echol davar shedarko le'echol, with the thought to eat something that's supposed to be eaten, or lahaktir davar shedavar lahaktir. This is very much not like Rebbe Eliezer, because it says, davar shedarko lechol in, something that you're supposed to eat will make something pigel, but she'ein darko lechol lo. But if it's something you're not supposed to eat, like, for example, a human eating the aliyah, because it's supposed to go on the mizbeach, that won't make it into pigel. So that's the Rabbanan. So then you're saying, the Seifa at Anra the Rabbanan. That has to be the opinion of the Rabbanan. So now you're explaining this Shmuel, that Reisha Rebbe Eliezer and Seifa Rabbanan, which obviously we don't like to do. It's one Mishnah, it should be internally consistent. Amrali says Shmuel, no, I don't really have such a big problem with that. That is how I have to explain our Mishnah. Yeah, I agree it's not ideal, but there's two different parts to our Mishnah. The first part you should understand is going like Rebbe Eliezer, because it mentions the tail of the Aliyah. And the second part is the Rabbanan. Says Rav Huna, I have a better answer, because obviously that's a dochik, to say our Mishnah is going like two different Tanaim. Says Rav Huna at the bet, I have a bet for the Shita Mikubetzet in mind, around 10, 12 lines down. Rav Huna says, your assumption is wrong, because the Mishnah does not talk about eating the aliyah, right? Eating the tail would be a big problem, because according to the Chachamim, there would be no issue of pigol on eating the tail, because you're not supposed to eat it at all. But the point of our Mishnah is that or aliyah, lav ka'aliyah dami. The point of the Mishnah is that's the skin, it's the hide, the leather on top of the aliyah is not the aliyah. It's not what was put on the mizbeach. And how do I know that? I'm a Rava, my time in Rav Huna. It says, Rava, what's the reason for Rav Huna? Because it says chelbo ha'aliyah, the fat of the aliyah, meaning the fat, velo or aliyah, not the skin or the leather on top of the aliyah. And so therefore, says Rav Huna, my explanation is that the reason the Mishnah says that this is edible is because it's not what's put on the mizbeach. Normally, you would take it home. Now, of course, like I said, it's not usual to eat leather, but there are certainly some skins that are very soft, and I guess the area over the tail is soft, and you can roast it and put it, pop it or something, and yeah, it's edible. So that's Rav Huna's answer. Rav Chisda says, I have got a third answer, which is that the olam or ha'alya ka'alya dami. In fact, the skin of the alya is like the alya. But why is it edible? Here we're referring to a gedi. Remember that a gedi, little tiny little goat, doesn't really have an aliyah, right? There is no part. The aliyah only refers to certain animals have this tail. A gedi does not have this fat tail. Now, so it doesn't really have any aliyah, but it has an area that's a little bit of a tail that's not put on the mizbeach. So since we're talking about a gedi, it's actually not a part that's put on the mizbeach, and that's the chiddush of our Mishnah, is that an animal that's tail is not put on the mizbeach, If you eat that tail, it's like you're eating the regular animal and you're chayiv pigel. Says the Gemara, so we have three answers now, right? Shmuel, Rav Huna, and Rav Chisda. Says the Gemara, Kula k'shmuel lo amri. Most people, I guess they took a poll in the Beit Midrash, or we're just saying historically, people did not explain our Mishnah like Shmuel because Shmuel has an obvious difficulty. Because in Shmuel's explanation, it has to be two Tanaim in the Mishnah. Reisha Rebbe Eliezer, V'Sefer Rabbanan lo mukmi. People don't want to say that a Mishnah is going like two Tanaim. Now, Rav Huna lo amri, the reason they don't like say like what Rav Huna says that we're talking about the tail of the aliyah, the skin, sorry, the or of the aliyah, and it's different than the aliyah. But that's a stretch because it's all one part of the body. Rav Huna lo amri, or aliyah ka aliyah dami, kamashmalo, right? Most people think that the skin is like the aliyah. It's not something special. So his answer is not so good. What about Rav Chisda? Rav Chisda, my tamil am. Rav Chisda had a beautiful explanation. Rav Chisda's chiddush was that we're talking about an animal where the aliyah, like it's a gedi, it's a goat, and the aliyah is not put on the mizbeach. So therefore, if a human wants to eat it, it's a regular food for a human to eat. So why don't we all explain the Mishnah that way? Because says the Gemara, what exactly is Rav Chisda teaching you? My kamashmalan, right? What's the chiddush of the Rav Chisda? Is that basically if you're eating the or of the aliyah, it's ka'aliyah dami. But since we're talking about a gedi, and you're allowed to eat the aliyah, if you eat the flesh, not the flesh, the skin, the or the hide on top of the aliyah, it's as if you're eating the aliyah. So what Rav Chisda's chiddush basically from the Mishnah is that eating the skin is like eating the thing, right? But that we know that from a Mishnah in Chulin. Tanina, we all know that because the Mishnah in Chulin says, and the Mishnah in Chulin is talking about Tuma, right? And it says the following: the Elosh oroteyem kibisaram. It gives a list of things. Remember, in order for something to be tameh, you have to have a certain size, either a kibetza or a kizayit, depending on what kind of tuma. So if you eat a piece of meat and it's too small, but you have skin on top of it that adds to it, the Mishnah says in Chulin, these are the following parts of the skin that the oroteyem, the skin is kibisaram, is like the meat itself, like the flesh. And it says in the Mishnah in Chulin, or shetachat that the skin the leather on top of the aliyah, or underneath the aliyah in this case, is like the aliyah. So thank you, Rav Chisda. It's a nice chiddush, but we don't need our Mishnah to tell us that. We have a Mishnah in Chulin. Says Rav Chisda, you're right. I agree with the Mishnah in Chulin, of course, but it's strict. You need to have our Mishnah by eating it in Kachim and the Mishnah by Chulin. Because I would have thought if I just read the Mishnah in Chulin that Hani Mili, the only time where we say that the skin over the aliyah combines with the aliyah is in Tuma. It's regards to Tuma, which is what we're referring to in Chulin, the Rachgit, because it's rachgit means it's soft, it's very flexible. So although it's hide, and hide is usually unedible, this is much more flexible hide. So it's mitzaref. So it comes together. It can be combined with the meat. Aval hacha, but when you're talking about a korban, remember by a korban it says the word limashcha. Mashcha means to raise something up, to lift it up. Mishich is to, make it holy. So it says by a karban limashcha, which implies ligidula, that everything brought on the mizbeach and surrounding karbanot has to be similar to kederach shamalachim ochlim. Has to be like the kings. You have to treat it with tremendous respect. And although it's edible, kings are not going around eating this tiny little skin on top of the aliyah. Lo avidi malachim da'achli achi. Kings eat very nice big steaks. They don't eat the skin, the hide of an animal. A malosa, you might think that it's not considered to be eating. Kamash Malan says, Rav Chisda, I disagree. This is edible. It's edible, even though maybe a king wouldn't want to eat it or not typical to eat it. It's considered to be food. And excuse me, just like it is mitame, because it's considered to be like the meat of the animal, it also is something that if you have a machshava of pigol, when you shech the animal, it will passel the whole animal. So that is Rav Chisda's explanation. Says the Gemara now, Meitve. We are a little bit more than halfway down.
What passes that tail portion?
I'm sorry?
He's talking. What is posel is that tail portion he's talking about, right? Well, why
No,
do we extend that to the whole animal?
because he had a machshava. So remember, it's the same way if he had a machshava, he slaughtered an animal and said, I'm going to eat a piece of the rib steak tomorrow, right? Or in 2 days. The whole animal becomes pigul because you had a machshava.
Right. Oh, but we're talking here, focusing on that piece of the tail.
Right. So we're saying that the piece of tail is like any other piece of the animal because since you're allowed to eat the tail of a gedi, With the gedi, you do not put the tail on the mizbeach. You're supposed to eat it, right? It's like any other part of the animal. If you have a machshava about this part of the animal, it's also going to passel the whole thing. So by a gedi, unlike a lamb, you can eat the tail. It's a little more complicated because there isn't really a tail. That's why you can eat it. There isn't a specific fat pad there, apparently. I don't know much about animals. That's what the Parshim say. But the part that is there, you can eat. So there is no alya, isser, on a
But
gedi.
if he's focusing on that tail section, whatever that tail, a tiny bit, but he says, okay, then he says, I'm going to think about it, eat it in 3 days. Then that's the shaykhut to piggle. Okay. So, but he's focusing on that. If he says I'm going to eat I don't know, the area that's the steak, then he says that becomes the piggle. But he's focusing on that area. So you can learn the body of the animal in one place. You can learn this little bit of tail in another place. But why would the whole animal be affected? I mean, we learned that already before. He's just now
Right.
he's talking about this. We learned that the animal, you have the concept of piggle if he talks about the whole animal. Now he's focusing on this, even this little tail piece. If you say that, then that tail piece would be considered piggle. But we
So
don't have
remember
to.
that.
We don't have to have a set to make this become the whole animal because you already learned about the whole animal.
Correct. The Chiddush according to Rav Chisda is that even though there'd be some ambiguity as to whether this is called eating or not, right? Because this part of the animal is generally not eaten. Most people don't think of eating the skin, the hide of a large animal as being part of eating. He's saying that because it's a part of the animal that is in fact soft, it's rachich, it's soft, and you can roast it, I guess, and salt it, it's considered to be eating. But it's like any other part of the animal, and it's exact same halacha.
Yeah, okay, it's like any other part of the animal, but doesn't. Right. I said I I agree with that, but it doesn't mean that the whole animal automatically becomes because he wasn't thinking about the rest of the animal now. He's thinking about that little piece.
Right. So that's the point of our Mishnah is that even if you think about one piece, as long as it's a kazayit, it has to be a kazayit, then the whole animal becomes pigul and the whole thing becomes puzzle. And it's the same by sprinkling the blood. If you sprinkle a little blood or burn a little part, any part that's a significant part, meaning a kazayit, will make the whole thing pigul or puzzle. Now, asking our matve, let's ask the following question from the following Breita, and we are now at the first word on the line, again, a little more than halfway down. This is a Tosefta, and the Tosefta is very interesting because the way it differs from our Mishnah is that it specifically talks about a carbon ola. Now, an ola, of course, is different than a regular carbon shlamim, for example. In a shlamim, you shech the animal, you put the blood on the mizbeach, you put some of the parts on the mizbeach, and you take the rest of it and you eat it, right? But by an ola, you don't eat any parts of it. So everything goes on the mizbeach for the most part. Some things get thrown outside, but nothing gets eaten. So says the Bright the following: Hashochet et ola. Let's say you do a shchita of a carbon ola, and your thought is lahaktir kizayit me'ar tachat alya, that you're going to burn on the mizbeach a kizayit of the skin under the alya, right? So now remember, by a ola, putting on the mizbeach is the equivalent to eating by a shlamim, right? Because you don't eat by an ola, but you burn it. So your thought is to burn on the mizbeach a kizayit of the skin under the alya. Chutz limkomo, if you think to do it in the wrong place, it's pasul ve'embo karet, like every case. If it's chutz lizmano, if you think I'm going to burn this in 3 days or 2 days, pigol v'chayavin alav karet, right? Okay, that so far is very similar to our Mishnah. And continues the Bright and the Tosefta. Elazar ben Yehuda ish avelim omer. It's an unusual Tana, but he's one who's quoted. Elazar ben Yehuda, a person of avelim, said, Mishum Rabbi Yaakov, and Chen hayu Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda ish kvar ikus, omer Mishum Rabbi Shimon, that echad, there's other parts of the animal that are considered to be edible, even though usually you wouldn't think of them as being edible, meaning echad or beta prasot behimadaka. The or, the skin, the leather of the beta prasot. Beta prasot means where the hooves are. So your feet usually you think are very hard, but in a behemoth in a small animal like a lamb or a goat, there's a soft amount of skin there that's actually edible if you're really hungry, right? And so that's considered to be food. Vechad or harosh al eagle harach. If you take a young eagle, a young calf, the first year, the skin on the head, although later as the eagle gets older, it becomes very hard and tough. When it's young, that's considered to be soft and it can be turned into food. The echad or shetachat aliyah, and the leather that's underneath the aliyah, which is what we've been talking about. The kol shemanu chachamim gabi tuma, and wherever the chachamim said by tuma that elo she'orotehem kibisaram, right? The Mishnah we just quoted from Chulin. These things, the leather is like the meat for tuma. And what is he? Why are they adding that last case? Lahavi arshal beit haboshet. That's referring to arshal beit haboshet. Beit haboshet is the area near like the vaginal, the perineum of an animal, which is, again, it's a very soft area, and in theory, it can be turned into something that can be eaten. In all of those cases, if you have a machshava that you're going to put those leathers that are soft and edible onto the mizbeach chutz komo, if your thought is to do it outside of the right place, it's pasul ve'im bo karet. Chutz l'zmano pigo v'chayavin alav karet. Okay, so this is a very similar Mishnah to ours, except it's referring to an ola. Now, why is it referring to an ola? Right? Why would a Mishnah come and say ola in aval zevach lo? It would
Why
imply.
would it not be a shlomim? Because the shlomim is a female, right? And isn't an ola has to be a male?
Yeah, so it's a really good point.
Because you're talking about the beta taboshet, about beta boshet.
Correct. So it's a great question. But the reason, so let me answer your first one, which is easier to answer, which is that the Mishnah here says Ola, right? And the way we know it, it says Hashochet Ola. I mean, that's the question. So we're asking, why would the Braita specifically say in Ola, it should also be true, like you just said, by a Shlamim, right? There's no reason. Now, of course, with the Shlamim, it doesn't mean going on the Mizbeach. It would mean eating it, okay? So let's read the Gemara. Ola in Avos Zevach Lo. It implies it's referring to an Ola and not to a Zevach, right? Where am I? Yeah. Says Rav Bishma Rav Huna. I understand the explanation of Rav Huna, who said that remember Rav Huna's explanation in our Mishnah, right? Rav Huna said it's referring to it's edible, right? That the or of the aliyah is similar to the aliyah itself, right? So therefore, says Rav Huna, I understand why it says ola, because if you had a thought to burn the or of the aliyah of a shlamim, it would not make it pigel, because the or of the aliyah of a shlamim, according to Rav Huna, is edible. And remember, if you put something on the mizbeach that you're supposed to eat, it's not making it pigel. So I get according to Rav Huna, that's why we said an ola specifically, because you're putting on the mizbeach. And if it was a shlamim and you put on the mizbeach, it wouldn't be a problem. Elia Rav Chisda, according to Rav Chisda, who says, look, that the or of the aliyah is exactly like the aliyah, right? And therefore, it's the same as the meat. My area de tani ola lisni zevach. Why, in fact, does it say ola? Let it say any carbon, like you said, including even a shlamim. Says Rav Chisda, no, I have two answers for you. Either Ibayit Ema Ba'aliyah Shel Gedi, either referring here specifically to the Aliyah of Gedi, which is only put on the Mizbeach if you have a Ola, because generally if it's a regular carbon, you can, not a regular carbon, like a Shlamim, you can eat the Aliyah of the Gedi because it's not considered to be prohibited, or Ibayit Ema T'ni Zevach, or just change the word. I agree that you're correct, that it's a little bit unusual to say Ola, and in fact, one answer for Rav Chisda is just teach the word Zevach, and that this would be referring to even a Shlamim. So that would be the explanation of Rav Chisda. So that we have three answers, and they're all sort of, we say there's problems with them, but we are with them. Let us go now. We're at the two dots.
Earlier you mentioned the skin of the tail versus the fat of the tail. So why are we talking? Why is the Gemara mention here the skin underneath the tail? The skin is usually above, is the outer covering. Why we say takata aliyah?
I mean, tacha just means the skin, like it means underneath it in the animal, not below. I mean, not inside the tail. It means if you're an animal standing, you have a tail on the back. It means the area right below it.
The area right below what?
Below the tail, like where the tail sticks out of the animal, right geographically, south, right below the tail.
But it says that the skin mitachet the aliyah.
Right, tacha means underneath. If you hold up a tail, look at my hand, underneath my hand, like the lower side.
Or it doesn't mean.
It doesn't mean inside the tail.
Okay.
So now I'm going to read. I know this is a very, very, very complicated sugya, and I'm going to read a few psukim that are very important. I'll reference them. The Gemara, of course, references them too. The first pasuk, which is what we call the long pasuk, is in Parshat Tzav. In the seventh parak of Parshat Tzav, it says, bring a shlamim, bring it on the third day, right? I'm sorry, bring it on the second. You can eat on the second day. And then the pasuk says, I'm reading now Perik Zion, pasuk, I'm going to read pasuk, sorry, Yud Zion says, if you leave over, notami basar zevach, if you leave over meat of the animal, biyom hashlishi be'eshi sarif, you should burn it on the third day because you're not allowed to eat it anymore. And now pasuk Yudchet, which is our key pasuk here. If you eat, and it says a double language, hey achel, ye achel, right? Ye achel, hey achel, ye achel. If you eat, and we don't know why it says it twice, the meat on the third day, when you're not supposed to, lo ye ratzeh. It doesn't work. You don't get a kapara. Now, we're going to learn in later today and tomorrow that obviously this can't mean if you eat the meat on the third day, right? You brought the carbon on Sunday. You got a kapara when you brought it on Sunday. The fact that you eat the meat on Tuesday doesn't retroactively change the kapara. So we're going to explain this whole pasuk is not referring to actually eating the meat. It's referring to thinking about eating the meat. So if on Sunday when you brought the carbon, you thought, I'm going to eat the meat on Tuesday, then it doesn't work. But that, of course, is going to take us some time to get to that understanding. Continues the pasuk, hamakrivoto, the one who brings the carbon, lo yechashev lo, it doesn't count for it, right? Lo is him or it. Now we don't know who the it is. It doesn't count for what. Pigul yiyeh, it is pigul, v'nefesh ochelt mimenu avenot tisa, and a person who eats it gets a punishment. That's the pasuk, the long pasuk in Tzav. There's a much shorter version in Kedoshim, which says, and this is now Perik Yud Tet, pasuk Zion, Im he'achel ye'achel b'yom hashlishi, pigul hu lo yiratzeh. Period. So that's a much shorter pasuk. If you eat it on the third day, it's pigul, you don't get a kapara, right? So says the Gemara now, how do we know all this? Psul ve'embo karet, our Mishnah said that if you have a machshava chutz limkomo, it's pasul, but you don't get karet. If you have a machshava chutz lizmano, it's pigul, and you're chayiv karet. Right? So the pasuk I just read you it says avonot tisa, which always means you carry your sin, which sounds like karet. So how do you know that? Amar Shmuel says Shmuel because there's trei kraiktivim. There's two psukim. The two psukim I just read to you, right? And you learn it from the two psukim. Now how? Mahi, what are you talking about? Says the Gemara. So Amar Rabba, no, this is what it means. The pasuk says shlishi, right? If you eat the basar on the third day, that means third day is zechutz lizmano. It means if you eat the basar on the third day, meaning not when you're supposed to. A shlamim is supposed to be day 1 or day 2. You have a machshava to eat it in the wrong time. So that's how you know chutz lizmano. Then the pasuk continued to the word pigulhu. That is zel chutz limkomo. The word pigul adds another case where you had a machshava outside of the right place. And then it continues, and it says, so now we know two things. You're not allowed to do it outside of the right time and outside of the right place. The pasuk then continues and says, we're at the first wide line, the hanefesh ha'ochelet mimenu. Mimenu implies it, not them. The person who eats it, meaning echad velo shnayim, one of them is chayav karet, not both. And that's chutz lizmano, lemute chutz limkomo. The thought chutz lizmano is pigol and karet. Chutz limkomo is pasul, but it's not karet. Says the Gemara, well, how do you know that, right? You just said there's two things, and one is and one isn't. But why don't you learn the opposite? Ema, why don't you read the following? Hanefesh ochelet mimenu, that when it says the person who eats it is referring to not it chutz lizmano, maybe it's chutz limkomo, lemuti chutz lizmano. So how do you know if one thing is chayav karet and one is not? Why do you assume that the outside of the time is karet and the place is not? Says well, mistavra, it's more logical chutz lizmano adif, that in fact the first case, the patach be, we started with the case of chutz lizmano, b'yom hashlishi. So therefore it's worse. Adarabah, why don't you say the opposite? Chutz limkomo adif to samachle, that the second prohibition is worse because that's where it connected the words your chayiv karet. So, meaning you can't prove it from there. El Amar Abai says, okay, let's start over. 3 lines in the bottom. Amar Kiyasar Yitzchak bar Avdimi, Amar Rav. There's a little debate about who this is in name of. Well, Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi came, he said in the name of Rav, Samech adatani tana. We're relying on the following Braita. There, he says the Braita. Now, again, these are the same psukim. Kishu omer shlishi beparshat kedoshim tiyu. It says the word shlishi in Parshat Kedoshim, which is, as I read before, the short parsha. She'ein tamalomar. There's no purpose of repeating this. Shari Kfar Nemar already said in Parshat Tzav, Im he'achel yechal mibasar zevach hashlamim b'yom hashlishi pigol hu lo yiratzah. Right. So we already said that. So why are we turn the page. Why does it repeat it in Parshat Tzav? It's telling you, Im eino inyan chutz lizmano, if there's no purpose in telling me another prohibition of an animal chutz lizmano, because we already said Yom HaShlishi in Tzav, T'nei in the chutz limkomo. So, okay, so actually, according to this reading, the way we knew chutz limkomo is not from the same pasuk, where it said Yom HaShlishi and Pigol, which are two limudim. It's because there's one pasuk in Tzav and one pasuk in Kedoshim, right? And miut rachmana gabi notar, the pasuk limits when the prohibition of notar to say by notar. I read that pasuk. Ochlav avona yisa. Actually, I didn't read it. Those who eat notar get punishment. Lemute chutzdim komo. That you don't carry a avon, you don't get karet if it's chutzdim komo, right? So because in kedoshim it says don't do this on the Yom HaShlishi. And if you eat it, you get karet. And we said don't do this is referring to chutzdim komo. Well, how do you know that?
Well, that's the third pasuk. How do you explain the reason for the first two pasukim?
It's because the first two pasukim are referring to machshava. You're thinking about it. The third pasuk, which I didn't read, but it's pasuk chet over there, is referring to eating it. That's if you add ochlo means you literally eat it. Avonot yisa.
But why do you need the first two pasukim? We learn from one. Isn't that sufficient?
So right now we're going to get back there, like I told you, but right now this Braita says you need two psukim. That the first pasuk is not sufficient to tell you both things.
It says im eno inyan the chutzmano, right? That's where it begins. So if it's not referring to this, so what's wait, the first pasuk is not referring. What's it referring to?
The first pasuk is referring to chutz lizmano. The second pasuk is the one that says don't do it on the third day, which sounds like chutz lizmano. But says this Tana, you don't need another pasuk for chutz lizmano because he said that. So
right.
in the chutz limkomo, and then the next verse.
So this refers to the chutz. The second pasuk refers to chutz limkomo.
Correct. That's the pasuk in Kedoshim.
Oh, okay. So that's what the first pasuk is chutz lizmano, and the second was chutz limkomo.
Correct. So then then there's a third pasuk, which I didn't really read, which continues and says, if you eat it, actually, not think about it, but you eat it, you get karet. And that's telling you only it, ochlav, meaning only it, but not chutz limkomo. Ask the Gemara, but maybe ema ochlav avano yisa. Maybe when the pasuk then says if you eat it you get karet, it's saying if you eat this food that's chutz limkomo you get karet, and notar does not get karet, right? So maybe notar, which is a third case. Remember now we have three things. This is very confusing, but one is a machshava chutz lizmano. Second is a machshava chutz limkomo, and the third is where the meat is physically left over and you ate it on the third day. So not a machshava, but actually eating notar, eating food that's left. Notar means leftover, right? Like with the carbon pesach. So maybe the notar shouldn't get karet. Says more, well, mistavra, it's logical that notar, how do they look maybe karet? In fact, notar we think would have karet because the migmar avon chutz lizmano, we want to compare avon by notar or by this pasuk to avon when it says it by chutz lizmano, the damile bizav. It's similar in two different ways, a zayin and a bet. Zayin stands for zman, meaning they both have to do with the time of when you brought the carbon, and the bet has to do with something that applies in a bama. Because remember, if you have a carbon and a bama, there's no concept of chutz limkomo. A bama by definition is not in any place; it's wherever you are. So having a machshava chutz limkomo doesn't apply to a bama, but time prohibitions do apply to a bama. So therefore, we want to compare notar to chutz lizmano, and the odd man out is chutz limkomo. Adarabba. But I have another way to look at it. Chutz limkomo look me b'karet. Why don't you say that chutz limkomo should be chayiv karet and notar should be left out? Lemigmar avon chutz lizmano. We learn it from chutz lizmano. The damile the mikdash. Now mikdash is another acronym for mem kuf dal and shin, and it's a lot longer, right? Because they're very similar in many ways. What's the mem? The mem is machshava, that they're both intentions, not actions, unlike notar. The kuf is that they both have to have a kizayit, meaning not you have to have a kizayit, but that if you have a thought about a kizayit, as we said earlier, it passes the entire karban. The dalet is dam, that they both refer to an action of thinking about sprinkling the blood, and the shin has to do with yom hashlishi, right? It says the extra word yom hashlishi by both of them. So how can you prove it? El Amr Rabbi Yochanan, says Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, let me start again, another attempt. Again, we're going to actually come away from all of this, so that's why I'm not spending too much time. But says Rabbi Yochanan, we are now 10 lines from the top. Tani debei Rav Zavdi bar Levi. Zavdi, the son of Levi, taught the following: Atya kodesh kodesh. That in fact, there's another limud. It says the word kodesh. Where does it say the word kodesh? It says here, and this is in Kedoshim, et Kodesh Hashem Chilal, that you've desecrated the Kodesh to Hashem, v'nichrta, and therefore you get karet. V'chtiv hatam, and it says way back in the end of Sefer Shemot, v'sarafta notar ba'esh, and it says the word Kodesh continues, sarafta notar ba'esh, don't eat it, ki kodeshi. Malala notar, afka notar. Just like Kodesh there is referring to notar, here too Kodesh is referring to notar. And since we now know the pasuk is referring to notar, because it says the word Kodesh, Miut Rachmana Gabi Notar, the Torah says specifically in this pasuk of Notar, Ochlav Avono Yisa, that if you eat this, you get karet, it, Lemute Chutz Lemkomim karet. So now we exclude Chutz Lemkomim karet, says Rabbi Yochanan in this name of this person, that we now have a proof that the first pasuk in Parshat Tzav is referring to Chutz Lizmano, and it says karet. The second pasuk, which is the first one in Parshat Kedoshim, but the second pasuk is referring to Chutz Lemkomo, where it doesn't say karet. The third pasuk is referring to notar. We know that from Gzera Shava, and there it says karet. So by Chutz Lizmano and notar you get karet. By Chutz Lemkomo you don't get karet. Says the Gemara, but that's a wonderful assumption. But how do you know that the first pasuk in Tzav, and which is what called the long pasuk, is referring to Chutz Lizmano, and the first pasuk in Kedoshim, which is the second overall, the short pasuk, is referring to Chutz Lemkomo. My Chazit asked the Gemara, how do you know, or why do you think, Dikra Aricha, that the long pasuk in Parshat Tzav is Chutz Lizmano, and the word Shlishi in Parshat Kedoshim to you, the short pasuk, is Chutz Lemkomo. Epachana. Why can't you switch it around? I mean, the pasuk basically says the same thing. It says, don't eat it on the third day. And we said one of them is to tell you literally the third day, and one is to tell you the thought out Chutz Lemkomo. Says the Gemara, Mistavra Aricha b'Chutz Lizmano. It makes logical sense that the pasuk, the long pasuk in Parshat Tzav, is referring to Chutz Lizmano because it has the word avon and Gamar avon minotar. It says the word avon in that pasuk. It says the word avon notar. And remember that Chutz Lizmano is very similar to notar, the damile bezav. As we said earlier, it has the zayin, the zman, and the bama. That's very similar. Adarab, asked the same question we had earlier. Aricha b'chutz lemkomo. Why don't you then say that the long pasuk is referring to chutz lemkomo and the shlishi dekoshim tiyu b'chutz lezmanu mishum dedamilei, because it is similar to it in some ways. How is it similar to it? Samcha become a maile, right? Because since chutz lezmanu, you're saying, is similar to notar, put them together. So when you have two psukim back to back in Kedoshim, one is notar and one is unknown, make the unknown chutz lizmano because it's very similar to notar. So say in Kedoshim we're talking about similar cases, chutz lizmano and notar, and in Tzav we're talking about chutz lemkomo, and switch it all up. El Amar Rava, says Rava, and this actually, we've quoted this Rava before, and this is really the purpose, the whole limud. Says Rava now, this is really important, 10 lines from the bottom of Daf Chet Amabet. Says Rava, you have to read everything from that first pasuk. Forget about this whole discussion about two psukim, one in Tzav, one in Kedoshim. Kula mikra aricha atyon. We derive all of the rules of chutz lizmano and chutz lemkomo from the long pasuk. Dichtiv, the pasuk says the words, v'im hey achel ye achel. If you eat it. Now, that's a double language. So why does it say hey achel ye achel? Says Rava, b'shtei achilat hakatuv medaber. The pasuk is referring to two kinds of eating. One kind of eating is a person's eating, right? What part of a carbon that you're supposed to eat. And one is referring to what the mizbeach eats. Echad achilat adam, ve'echad achilat mizbeach. Okay, that's the first halacha. The second words, and the next words in the pasuk are, im he'achel ye'achel, mi bisar zevach shlomav, from the meat of the shlamim. What is that referring to? It has to be similar to a shlamim. Ma shlamim mifaglim u'mitpaglim. By shlamim, the animal itself becomes pasul, and the person who did it gets is chiyuv. So af kol mifaglim u'mitpaglim. So too, you only have a halacha of pigol when there's a mifagel, meaning a person, a kohen, who says pigol, and a mitpagel, which is the part of the carbon becomes pasul. But there are certain carbonot, like Rashi talks about here, like an olata of, like certain carbonot, where none of the carbon becomes pasul, and therefore there's no concept of pigol. Okay. The next halacha is that it says bayom hashlishi. Now shlishi is referring to the third day. That's a machshava chutz lizmana. That's how we know chutz lizmana. It continues and says lo yeratzah. If you have that machshava, the carbon does not work. That's how we learn the halacha that we've talked about many times already, that kahartzat kasher, kach hartzat pasul. That the way a regular kosher animal is done
He froze.
Share. Just like when we talk about
The whole system froze. You got to repeat that. You were stuck in
it
froze.
only becomes kosher if you do all the right things, meaning you bring the matirav, meaning the parts that make it mutar, which is sprinkling the blood, on the mizbeach. So afar tza'at pasul, so too, in order for an animal to be pigol, it can't just be that part of it is done. You have to be ad yakriv kol matirav, until you bring all of the parts on the mizbeach. And as we said before, if you mess something else up in the process, it's not pigol anymore. Ham makriv. Now the pasuk continues. Again, we're dashing every word in the pasuk. Ham makriv. That tells you the one who brings it. To tell you behakrava nifsal. It's puzzle on day one. Remember, day one is Sunday in this case. It's not puzzle. I don't nifsal b'shlishi. Torah's not saying if you leave it over, your thought is to do it on the third day, and by the third day it becomes pasul. It becomes pasul today because it's talking about a machshava, not about an action of eating it on the third day. The word oto continues, Hamakriv Oto tells you that now that we're talking about it, meaning it being the carbon. B'zevach katuv medaber ve'eno medaber b'kohen. We're not referring. Remember, the whole pasuk says that it becomes pasul. So you might have read this pasuk naively and thought the kohen becomes pasul because since he didn't get his act together and he had a wrong thought, the kohen pasels the carbon himself. Sorry, from being a good kohen because since he can't think the right things, we throw him out. But the Torah says Hamakriv Oto. We're talking about it being the carbon. The carbon becomes pasul, not the Kohen. And then it continues, the last words on today's daf are lo yechashev. Don't, cheshev means it won't count. It doesn't, you don't get credit. You don't get as if you did a karban. What that means here is that lo ye'arev bo machshavot achirot. You can't mix into it other machshavot, meaning that if you, remember, we had this case many times, that if you think I'm going to do the karban chutz lizmano, and I'm also going to do it for the wrong person, then it's not pigol, because since it would otherwise be, I mean, a chatas, let's say, or a pesach, since it would otherwise be pasul, you can't count that as pigol. And finally, says the Gemara now, top line of Daf Chavtet, it says the word pigol. What's the word pigol? We already know you can't do it chutz lizmano. So this refers to, says Rava, ze chutz limkomo. This is how we know chutz limkomo. And it continues, we're just going to go to the end of Rava. Yihiyah, it says pigol yihiyah at the second line. What does yihiyah teach you? Milamed, right? Shemitztarfim zemzeh. This tells you that it can be it together, meaning, and we're going to have this case later, that let's say you think I'm going to do half a kazayit outside, which is chutzlim and koma, but it's not pasul, it's not a kazayit. I'm going to do half a kazayit chutz lizmano. Then in fact, they combine together. And since half is done wrong and half is done wrong, the whole carbon becomes pasul. We're going to learn that later. And finally, the pasuk finishes, "V'hanefesh ha'ochelet mimenu." This is the main pasuk. A person who eats it, mimenu is lashon yachid, echad v'lo shnayim, meaning one of the prohibitions is chayav, one kares, and one is not. Ezu, which one is chayav karet? Zeu chutz lizmano. The one that's chayav karet is the machshava chutz lizmano, the gamer avon minotar, the dam milei bizav. A notar is when you eat an animal in the wrong time, for sure is chayiv karet. So we learn from there that a thought to eat the animal in the wrong time is also chayiv karet and pigol, and a thought to eat an animal in the wrong place, or to shecht it in the wrong, or to sprinkle the blood in the wrong place, or put the animal's parts in the wrong place on the mizbeach, that is an isser, but it's not an isser karet. And so this is Rava's beautiful, beautiful drasha that I encourage you, Nava, to review many times so you get it down. And we will stop here because we're up to the end of the daf, and God willing, pick it up tomorrow. But I'm of Papa Le'abaya, the Rava.
You didn't answer that question earlier, that a female animal cannot become an ola.
That is correct. I think there are very, very rare exceptions. I think there's some ola. I can't remember, to be honest.
No, it says that if you look, the Mishnah and Shkalim, and that's Rabbi Eliezer's position, brings it. That's in the Mishnah and Shkalim. I think it's the fourth parak in Shkalim that
Right.
he says, when he talks about the exchanging the animal, the consecrating the makdish nechasav, and talks about behemot reuyot, right? So he says that, and he talks about the olon and the shkat and the in the context of shkalim and exchanging them for other people and for the poor people and so forth. There's a whole section there. And the olot are male animals. And whether male can be shlamim, that's true, but a female cannot be an olah. And a female.
You're 100% correct. I don't remember the answer. Tosis, I think, asked the question, but I don't really see his answer. So let me get back to you on that. Okay. It is a great question. I don't. I remember thinking about it and talking about it, but I don't recall the answer. So let me get back to you, Ken. Please hold your bated breath. I think I know the answer, but let me confirm. But it is a very good question, and obviously, a male animal does not have or beit haboshet according to Rashi's pshat. That's referring to sort of the perineum, the vaginal skin. It's a good question. We'll come back to it. Okay, we're going to stop here. Ken, do you have a minute? You're still here. Do you want to learn in person on Yom Tov? Are you able to do that? Because we could find a time if you are.
I don't have an answer for that right now.
Okay.
Because sometimes depends on how the chag
Yeah, no, I understand.
progresses.
Okay.
And
Let me know because the schedule in shul is a little complicated because it's Simchas Torah. There's a lot of stuff going on. I want to find a time that works for people, but I don't know if there's any time that's best for you. We're happy to take that into account. So if you think about it, if you can share, be happy to schedule. If you can't do it, you can't do it, but we're going to try to learn in person. I'm just very flexible on the timing. We just want to find something that works. Okay, we'll be in touch. Have a great day.
all right.
En outre, il est très sympathique, pas seulement compétent. En outre, il est très sympathique, pas seulement compétent. En outre, il est très sympathique, pas seulement compétent.
Absolument.
En outre, il est très sympathique, pas seulement compétent.
Absolument compétent.
Ce livre est intéressant. Il est en outre facile à lire.
C'est facile. C'est facile.
Elle parle espagnol. En outre, elle connaît un peu d'italien.
C'est plus. Et puis, sans compter.